okay? Early and eyewitness, just like the George Washington question. We want people who are there, and we want people who are in the right place. You say, well, eyewitnesses could be wrong. Yes, they are, but what are you going to do? Cite nine eyewitnesses because eyewitnesses could be mistaken? No, we still use eyewitnesses. And we want them to be people who are in the right time, right place, asking the right questions, and so on. And it's real helpful if they're enemies. It's real helpful if they change their view. It's real helpful if there's checks and balances, and so on. That's how we do history. All right. On my little timeline here, that's going to be creation down there. This is the cross. Scholars usually say 30 AD, but you'd be surprised how seldom they answer that question. Probably the second most popular date's 33. I'm just going to say ground zero, give or take. It's about 30 AD. Down there is 2011. Now, before I do minimal facts, let me give you a typical way that somebody, I'm going to have to be real sketchy, but when somebody says the New Testament's at least a historically trustworthy book, let me talk about how they're going to do that. If you say, well, how do I know the resurrection happened? On this timeline, I'm going to say, well, one very common on the reliability argument response is going to say, well, the book of Mark is written, and I'm going to use skeptical dates, okay, so you can see it's not that huge an issue. The book of Mark is written about 70 AD. We're only plus 40. You have to study ancient history to know how good plus 40 is. It's just, it's great time period. Okay, using critics' dates, Matthew, about 10 years later at plus 80. Luke, about 5 years later at about plus 85. Acts, plus 85, plus 90, something like that. Everybody, conservatives and liberals, puts John at about 95 AD. So my point is that if the worst it gets is we're about plus 65 to John. Now, critics often deal with sort of a double standard when they deal with the New Testament. And they're going to say, yeah, 95 AD, Matthew, 50, Luke, 55. Isn't that getting a little bit late? Well, when they ask questions like that, I'm not trying to be mean, but either they haven't studied a lot of ancient history, or they're not familiar with sources, or they're just being overly critical of the New Testament or whatever. Because if I said, all right, forget Jesus for right now, and let's say ground zero is the death of Alexander the Great. What are our best sources for Alexander the Great? What are the best sources? Well, there were several people who wrote during Alexander the Great's life, but we don't have any of those sources. We don't have any of them. They'd be very valuable. We don't have any of them. The sources we have for Alexander are, and I'd have to keep walking way out past this window, because the best sources for Alexander date 300 to 450 years after his death, about 330 BC. The two best sources are Arian and Plutarch, but they're also the latest sources. They're about plus 425 to 450 AD. That's a long time. You go, okay, fine, I get your point. Maybe Alexander's not the best example. We have better examples than that. Yes, we do. But I'm just using Alexander because he's such a prominent source. Well, how about somebody who's better data and closer to Jesus' time? Okay. How about Tiberius Caesar? He is the Caesar who's on the throne when Jesus dies just a few years after Jesus dies. We have 4 major sources for Tiberius and a total of about 10 sources for Tiberius. We have more than 10 sources for Jesus, and you go, yeah, but that's those prejudiced New Testament sources. Okay, more about that in a second. Used the way critics use, we still have more than 10 sources for Jesus. Do you know we have 12.5 sources outside the New Testament for Jesus? 12.5 sources outside the New Testament that are within 100 to 150 years after Jesus, which is fair in the ancient world. And now when I say 100 to 150, you realize that John's a lot closer than this. But back to Tiberius. We have 4 sources for Tiberius. One is contemporary. Whoa, we don't have anything like that for Jesus. But as I'm going to argue tonight, we do. We have sources, I'm going to spend the rest of my time explaining, that go all the way back to 30 AD for Jesus. Okay, so next best source. By the way, the earliest one for Tiberius, the historian who gives the contemporary data, he's the least useful. The least useful of the 4 sources. The best source for Tiberius is Tacitus. And Tacitus, if that's Tiberius down there, ground zero, Tacitus, we'd probably be 2/3 of the way up the pews here. Because Tacitus writes, sorry, that's the last guy. Tacitus is going to, if that's John, Tacitus is going to be about here. Tacitus writes about 120 AD. He's plus 80 after Tiberius. Suetonius, plus 85. And Dio Cassius, 2/3 of the way up or further. Dio Cassius is plus 180 from Tiberius. So, well, okay, I see where you're going, but I have the ultimate objection for you. Gospels record miracles of Jesus. That disqualifies him. Really? Well, Greco-Roman, we'd say in English, bios. It's not pronounced that way in Greek, but Greco-Roman bios. It's a genre of biography, Greco-Roman biography, the most reputable writing in the ancient world. We have, say, the father of history, so-called Herodotus, all the way through such names as Thucydides, and all the way up to Livy and Julius Caesar himself, and I already gave you some names, plenty, but we also have Tacitus, Suetonius, Dio Cassius, and so on. These guys write bios, and almost every Greco-Roman source includes miracles, prophecies, portents. Livy, probably second only to Tacitus for his reputation as a Roman historian, Livy records the founding of Rome by Romulus and Remus, the boys who were raised by a wolf, hundreds of years before his earliest source. It was obviously false. But we do doctoral dissertations on this material, and it's fair to use this material and start. You go, well, I don't trust any of it if there's miracles. Or if there's miracles of Greco-Roman sources, isn't that a rival to Christian miracles? Then you've got to ask the question of which miracles are evidenced. And I'll just say this to be provocative, and then I'm going to have to move on to my minimal facts deal. Almost every skeptical scholar, not the fly-by-night guys that don't work in the field, that just take shots at Christianity, but skeptical scholars, I don't care how liberal they are, how far to the left, virtually everybody today believes that Jesus was a miracle worker. Now, they're going to differ on how supernatural these things were and everything else. It's another question. But it's almost unanimous today. Among even Jesus seminar people, they'll call Jesus a miracle worker and exorcist. In fact, two of the best books that are out on this subject are each almost 500 pages.
Sorry, I've nearly fallen asleep there. So, that's Gary Habermas explaining more of his minimal fact approach. Basically, what he's going to say is you're looking at the dates of the spectrum of the text from the Gospels from 60 to 70, 80, maybe 90 AD, depending whether you're conservative or in the middle. But what he's going to say is that Paul's epistles, specifically 1 Corinthians 15, goes right back to 33 or 32 AD and gives you historical information about Jesus, and you can use that then to give a case for Jesus' resurrection. What we've just looked at in Gary Habermas's PhD is that uniformity of nature does not preclude the possibility of miracles. If it did, you would need to know all the miracle claims that have been made and have debunked them, and that's not been done. When you have a criteria for investigating miracles, as Hume did, it actually proved to him that miracles do take place, but he still didn't believe. Page 102. The human testimony favour of these occurrences is impressive, especially in view of the fact that it concerns claims of supernatural events. That's Habermas. Swinburne writes, Habermas is quoting Swinburne. No testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the facts which endeavours to establish, is always rejecting the greater miracle. Sorry about that. No testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous. I think that's David Hume. I would disagree. I think that it's basically just you're looking at history and you're just using historical methods, and if the historical methods are pointed to the fact that an event took place that seems to be supernatural, then so be it. You don't have to have greater evidence to outweigh the uniformity of experience. You just have to have evidence. Simple as that. Habermas says, the fact is that we only know a small part of nature and cannot be sure that what we do know will continue to be the same in the future. In other words, this so-called uniformity of nature, that the way things are, we don't see any dead people rise, is only our small understanding of the natural world. He quotes C.S. Lewis, I think, the whole idea of probability, as Hume understood it, depends on the principle of uniformity of nature. We observe many irregularities in nature, but of course all the observations that men have made or will make cover only a minute fraction of the events that actually go on. Our observation would therefore be useless. The whole idea of probability, as Hume understood it, depends on the principle of uniformity of nature. We observe many regularities in nature, but of course all the observations that men have made or will make only covers a minute fraction of the events that actually go on. Also, Habermas notes that we can't prove the uniformity of nature, and that I think that that Hume actually agreed with that in his writings. Habermas notes that David Strauss was heavily influenced by David Hume. Schleiermacher was of the opinion that miracles suspend the laws of nature. Bruno Barr strongly says that we could not have miracles coming to nature. Ernest Reiner said that Jesus did not know the laws of nature. Adolf Harnack said they were ancient ways of thinking. Paul Tillich said miracles can't interfere with the laws of nature. So Habermas deals with lots of scholars in the past and in the present on this issue of uniformity of nature, which is significant. If we're saying Jesus rose from the dead, we have to challenge this idea that because nature doesn't show any miracles, they don't happen. It can be challenged philosophically.